My name is Peter Thomas, and as Ed said, along with Lauren Sayer and Pete Cohen, we're going to talk about the journey of embedding agile thinking principles and tools in a K12 school here in Melbourne called Haileybury. And our format will be this. I'm going to talk a bit about the big picture context of the school and the HaileyburyX project, and Lauren will then give you some insight into the K12 education space. I'll then step in and review the approach we've developed called Agile Learning Design. Pete will talk about his role in all of this as an expert practitioner. And then Lauren will give us some insight into her experience as a lead learner in the thing we developed, which is the Agile Learning Design micro-credential. And then I'll wrap up and talk about some of the things we're going to do in the future. And there'll be time for questions and comments, which of course we're happy to talk about. So Haileybury. It's a K12 school, you may have heard of it, 6,000 students, 4 Melbourne campuses. It's also got campuses in Darwin and China, and in fact in Vietnam, Timor-Leste and the Philippines. Now the school's always seen itself as an innovator. So we've got a mature digital teaching and learning strategy, which Lauren looks after, and we'll talk about a bit later on, including using Canvas, the Canvas LMS for teaching and blended learning for thousands of courses. Now, a couple of years ago, as part of our review of the whole school, which you can see here, the timeline which started a couple of years ago, one of the proposals that came out was for an online platform, not just for our own students, but for learners anywhere in the world. And that's HaileyburyX, you can see on the map there, sort of just to the right of the thing. So we've got a whole bunch of things that happened in that review, including data dashboards and a managed device program and a thing called Thrive, which is our student wellbeing program. But HaileyburyX was something that came out of that review, and that's HaileyburyX. Now, it's an unusual thing, at least we think so, in its scope and aims. It's effectively a startup organically grown from within a K-12 school. That's unusual enough, I think, in itself, but one of the specific ways it's unusual is it's inherited some of the thinking from the startup ecosystem because we wanted to do something quite distinctive. And the distinctive thing is that we don't just want to create courses, but to create learning experiences that are living things, not mausoleums of content, which is sadly what lots of courses end up being. And of course, we want to upskill our teachers to create those learning experiences and find new ways to deliver them. And that requires an approach that puts learners in the center of our thinking. It demands iterative cycles of feedback, building of MVPs, and of course, new ways of continuing to evolve those learning experiences. But I guess at the outset, thinking back about that timeline, HaileyburyX was intended as a change process. Some of it about culture, some of it about seeing things differently, some of it about new processes and practices for the education industry. And Lauren will talk a bit about K-12 education and the context in which we operate in a little bit. But we also thought we needed some new work systems that blended the needs of current teachers with the needs of the next generation teachers. And the products of those work systems, learning experiences, would need to serve what we see as the needs of the next generation of learners too. And all of that in what is a very traditional industry. So what we're going to talk about is not a reaction to the pandemic, and it's not just a rush to get courses online. This thinking predated the pandemic, and our timeline on this project, as I always talk about, is that it's 30 years. It's Haileybury in 2050. So this is not just about building online courses. And whatever the results are of this period of remote teaching and whatever the future holds, we hope we're going to deliver some value all along the way. So let me introduce Lauren Sayer, who's our Director of Digital Learning, and she'll give you some bigger context about the state of play in K-12 education and some of the changes coming down the pipe for this industry. Lauren.
Thank you, Peter. So my name's Lauren Sayer. As Peter mentioned, I'm Director of Digital Learning. And what does a Director of Digital Learning do in a K-12? Well, we manage the digital learning and development for over 1,000 staff at Haileybury. So I have a team that work with me. We are all teachers, and I think that's an important part of we sit as a separate team under the teaching and learning banner, and we work with IT, but we are not part of the IT team. And I think that's very important. And I'll talk a bit about EdTech and how that works. I'm going to start by just starting to talk about what course design traditionally has been in a K-12, either online or offline. And over the years, it's followed an incredibly predictable pattern. And it's interesting, we're in ACARA have just announced that there will be a review of the national curriculum. And it too is following this same predictable pattern of, let's have a look at what the curriculum outcomes are. What do we want? So we always start with, what do we want to assess? What are the benchmarks? And we look at those in all the different areas. And from that, we develop assessment tasks. So there could be the exam, the assignments, or how are we going to measure that kids have achieved these outcomes? Then from there, we map the learning activities back to the outcomes. So how do we, and it's very backwards planning. And so what are the different activities that we can put in there to achieve those outcomes? Then adding the supplementary content. So where is the other content? And you'll often see teachers frantically trying to get content from anywhere to match the outcomes. And then after the development of all of this, the teachers deliver, and they deliver that. And as a general rule, what happens is these units or curriculum is done during a curriculum day or a curriculum period. And from there, they will frantically get everything ready and deliver the full unit that is fully developed, and they will review it I'll start with the best case scenario. They will review it at the end of the unit and ask students possibly how it was and review to make sure that they've achieved all the curriculum outcomes. At a worst case scenario, they will review it at the end of the study design, and a study design in schools is usually 3 years. So you can see that this predictable pattern has some key issues that are in there that could be of concern. If you could go to the next slide, Peter. So now in this room, there's probably not necessarily a room full of K-12 educators, and I'm sure if you were in the chat, you could give me a few more things that are missing in this traditional model of curriculum design. For me, the biggest thing is you never test it with students until you deliver it. You never really ask them how it's going until you're in front of them in that classroom. So that customer interaction and the ability for students to have that input, but also more importantly, you've created a whole unit and a delivery mechanism. At no point do you know exactly where all of your students in that room are starting. So you're starting at outcome 1. My big question with all of that is, well, what if they already know outcome 1, 2, and 3? Do you start and teach it back to them just in case? In that traditional model, that is what happens. The missing part also is the personalisation. And how do you personalise for a differentiated room? Most of the research shows that in an average classroom of 25 students, you can have an 8-year gap in between. So 8 years of learning in that one classroom. So if you're creating all of your curriculum resources beforehand, how do you personalise for what could be an 8-year learning differentiation between your classroom? Opportunities for feedback. So how do students give those feedback along the way? How do parents give feedback, and what are the opportunities? And then collaboration is a big area that tends to be missing. So there is a lot of cooperation in a traditional K-12 where I would like you to make test 1 and 2 for outcome 3, and I will create this other area, and then I'll use yours and you'll use mine. So there's cooperation, but actual collaboration where we work together is sometimes rare. And if it is there, it tends to be only in events that are planned. So schools often have a traditional notion of a curriculum day or a planning day. We all get together and we plan a unit, and then we go and disappear and we all teach it individually. So you're lacking that ongoing collaboration. Go to the next slide, Peter. So there are some significant pain points in this traditional model. The timing of the workload is possibly one of the biggest things, and it's definitely a learning I'll talk about later on. So the workload timing tends to be always at the start of a unit. So everybody is rushing to develop a curriculum unit ready for delivery. And so that delivery of day one, and everybody is pushing to do that. So that tends to mean that the bulk of that curriculum design workload is in usually the last 2 weeks of a Christmas holiday period or the first week of a term. And there is this intense amount of workload there. And then the workload sort of will taper off, and there'll be a bit large assessment workload, and then it will taper back up when you're into learning and developing the new unit. Customer interaction, the ability for students to co-design or to design parts of it in a traditional curriculum model is not apparent at all. There will sometimes be piecemeal approaches that sit in there, but actually for them to co-create, or for you to say, I've created part of this unit as a minimum viable product, how would we go through, is a very scary process and something that hasn't been happening. And then one of the big pain points in education is when there are problems, and then so when things don't get done by this timeline, and it's a huge amount of work to get a unit up before that, then it becomes blame, and you get a sorry culture. And the sorry culture is, I'm really sorry, but I ran out of time, or I'm really, really sorry, but it wasn't my fault, it was someone else's fault. And there's a lot of finger pointing in this situation of when this is happening. And you can imagine that doesn't make for a really safe space for teaching or for risk taking. So what we tend to get is sometimes subpar products in how that works, because people aren't focused on the best product they can do with the limitations. They're very focused on what they can deliver without being blamed. If you could go to the next slide, Peter. So I think one of the things that led us down to where we are today, and that I've learned being a participant learner in this process, is we're starting to see a wonderful convergence of K-12 and industry. We're seeing industry come and talk to K-12. We're also seeing that students don't necessarily go straight to university anymore, and the big players no longer require a university degree. They might want them straight out of Year 12. So that's an interesting place to be. So there is a big call for our students to have very strong skills coming straight out into out post Year 12. We're seeing a rise of micro-credentials, and although the ATAR is not dead yet, being able to see what beyond that number when you are finishing Year 12 you can offer is becoming a much larger thing. So when students are applying to go into university and tertiary, we're starting to see students having to come in with more than just that ATAR. What else have you done in these 13 years of schooling that contribute through? And we're starting to see more of competition in the education market with content providers. And this part's really exciting. And we've been doing a bit of writing about it, but traditionally it was textbooks that were being written and delivered in the education market. And now we're starting to see very popular content providers such as Netflix, such as Spotify in the podcast market, such as TikTok with EduTalk. We're starting to see a bit of competition. And what that is doing is asking the big question, which I think is always worth every teacher asking, is if kids didn't have to come to your class every day, would they come? And all of these other content providers are creating educational content that's 100% opt-in. So all of a sudden you can go and get education and educational content that's highly engaging that might not necessarily be provided with your school. And I think that's an interesting space for us to be in. And I'll lead in, I think that provides a nice shape up to introducing Pete Cohen, who